I'd like to make one point straight off, which plays off some of the comments already made today. Specifically about the importance of historical understanding to explain the weak and slow reaction of the West to a very clear Kremlin revisionism. We've heard that the West really doesn't understand, maybe Germany in particular, does not understand that Russia was not the only nation in the East fighting the Nazis, and that Ukraine and Belarus, in fact, paid a much higher price than Russia in World War II. Well, part of the problem for Western policymakers looking at this part of the world, I mean Eastern Europe, is that they've all learned what I call the Russian imperial view of history. And that Russian imperial view includes Ukraine as a subunit of Russian history rather than an individual history which should be understood alongside of Russian history. And that provides a natural understanding, and understanding I put in quotation marks, to the Russian version of what is happening in Ukraine. And not just in Ukraine, and what the old Soviet, well, what the post-Soviet Union calls the near abroad. Therefore, for example, such a distinguished scholar and statesman as Henry Kissinger, who in his book Diplomacy talked about Russia as a country which expanded hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of square kilometers every year, starting in the late 16th century, somehow comes to accept as natural a Russian sphere of influence, which gives Moscow the right to determine not just the external policies, but the internal policies of its neighboring states. So this is a problem in the Western policy circles in trying to respond properly to a very clear revisionist policy in Moscow. And I saw that firsthand working on these issues in the State Department in the mid-1990s. I remember giving speeches talking about American policy towards the post-Soviet space, speeches in which I said, well, pretty much everything the Kremlin is doing right now, this would be circa 1995, 1996, relating to large geopolitical issues, relating to economic and political reform against the mid-90s when Russia was on a democratic course, most of their policies were pretty good, with one exception: the policies in the near abroad. And while I can say that as a moderately senior, a lower senior U.S. official at DIS level equivalent, our policy did not truly reflect that. We would criticize, but very in low voice, what Moscow was doing in Georgia, in Transnistria in Moldova, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Azerbaijan. Although it is true, and this is important as a foreshadowing of the crisis that we see today, it is true that then Mayor Lushkov, Moscow's Mayor Lushkov, was playing dangerous games in Crimea in 1995. We spoke out against it in a higher voice, and in fact then President Clinton called Boria, President Yeltsin, to express concern. So that foreshadowed, in ways that Moscow never anticipated, a stronger, albeit still not strong enough, Western or United States response when the Kremlin seized Crimea in 2014 and began the covert war, or the not-so-covert war, in Donbass. Point is very simple, though. This is all a prelude to what happened in 2014. And so, when Moscow went into Crimea, Washington was slow to respond, and the West was slow to respond. Slow to respond, one, because again, the historical understanding did not allow for a clear recognition of what was happening. Two, because the West had gotten used to a friendly relationship with Russia, and for a sense of security which came from that friendly relationship. This was especially true in Europe, especially true in Germany, because to understand what the Kremlin was up to was to give up the notion that suddenly we had this wonderful and stable peace. Because Moscow was challenging, was cutting at the legs of that wonderful and stable peace. I joined the Atlantic Council in May of 2014, and I'd been working the previous 7 years on failed states. When I joined the Atlantic Council, one of our board members sent me Churchill's The Gathering Storm, part of his History of England. And of course, I read it in June, July of 2014. It's a long book. And I don't like the analogy of Putin with Hitler, because Putin is a much more minor danger, much more minor figure, historically. But what Churchill describes there in the West's failure to recognize, Britain's failure to recognize the danger of Hitler until after the Germans seized Czechoslovakia, is a real parallel to how the West has responded to Putin's revisionism, which goes back certainly to Georgia, but you could say even before that to the cyber war in Estonia in 27, and for that matter, goes back to statements coming out of the Kremlin ever since Putin took power, and statements going out of the Kremlin. If you read Sergei Plokh's excellent book, The End of Empire, to the very beginnings of the post-Soviet period. Because statements coming from very senior officials, including liberals such as Gorbachev and Yeltsin, foreshadow the Putin years. Anyway, long story short, the West reacted in Tallinn as if Moscow really didn't do anything nasty. The West reacted in Georgia in 2008 as if it was a single incident. So you had Sarkozy cobbling together some sort of peace, a peace which Sarkozy did not bother to maintain because Russia did not keep its commitments. And the West reacting after Crimea as if it was one more incident all by itself, instead of seeing the pattern. Now obviously there were people in the West who understood this. The leaders of all the Eastern European states understood this, but Western policymakers, meaning in Washington, in Berlin, in London, in Brussels, did not get it. However, and let me give you a personal anecdote which illustrates this. I joined the Atlantic Council in May of 2014. Immediately I headed into this fight. Although I was actually writing about this even before I joined the council, while I was still working on failed states. I go to brief General Dunford, who was then the new commandant of the Marine Corps, in September of 14. I was one of four briefers. My job was to talk about Russia and Ukraine. And I talked about this just as the way I'm talking to you. Now, I knew General Dunford from my work on failed states, and he says to me, John, you know, I'm just not buying it. This is General Dunford in September of 14. So I, John Herbst, was not sufficiently persuasive, not something I'd encountered before in my life. But in 2015, he's nominated by President Obama to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he testifies before Congress as part of the confirmation process, July of 2015. I could have written his talking points. They were wonderful. And in fact, he identified, as I had been identifying, Putin as the #1 national security danger, short-term, because Russia does not have the economic legs to be a long-term security threat, but short-term, the #1 security danger to the United States. Wonderful. Of course, the Obama White House, reflecting the geopolitical naivete of the president, undercut him immediately. But Dunford said this because Putin, in those 9 months between my briefing and his testimony, had persuaded General Dunford that he was a danger. And what we saw with General Dunford has happened, albeit not as clearly, in the West in that period. Very important, this was already noted by our other speakers, that Putin miscalculated the Western reaction to Ukraine. It may have been too slow and too weak, but it was much stronger and quicker than he anticipated. And the holding together of sanctions has been not just a testimony to the statesmanship of Chancellor Merkel, but to growing understanding in other quarters of Europe. I am confident that the Chancellor survives. Sanctions will continue indefinitely. I suspect that will also be true even if somehow she does not survive. I think what's happened in Washington, despite the instincts of President Trump, ensures that. I think that the congressional legislation that passed in July would make it much harder for any easing of sanctions in Europe. I also think, as my friend Glenn Howard and I were talking about today, even in Southern Europe, there's a growing appreciation of Kremlin mischief. I think Spain has gotten a very clear course of how nasty the Kremlin can be, given Kremlin machinations in Catalonia. And I hope to bring the Atlantic Council to Spain to make that even clearer. I think I've probably spoken long enough. Thank you.
Thank you, John.